Hi, I'm Charlie. Thank you for spending a little time with me today. Every story I share comes from a moment that changed how I understood myself, my family, or the world around me. Today's story is one of the quietest and most important ones I have, because it's about the day I found out that someone I loved had known me, really known me, long before I ever found the courage to say anything out loud. I still remember the day everything shifted, though it didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, the way most true things do, in a series of small moments that only made sense once I looked back on them as a whole. I grew up in a small house on a street lined with maple trees, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business, whether they wanted to or not. My father worked long hours at a hardware store downtown, coming home smelling like sawdust and metal shavings, his hands rough and always a little stained. My mother, Diane, stayed home when I was small, and later took a part-time job at the local library, which meant our house was always full of books that smelled like old paper and possibility. I had one older sister, Renee, 4 years ahead of me, who spent most of my childhood either ignoring me or bossing me around, usually both in the same afternoon. We weren't a wealthy family, but we weren't struggling either. We were comfortable in the way that meant new shoes came at the start of the school year and not a day before. And vacations meant driving 2 hours to my grandparents' lake house rather than flying anywhere exotic. It was a good childhood. I want to say that clearly, because so much of what I'm about to tell you might sound like it was hard, and parts of it were, but underneath all of it was a family that loved each other, even when we didn't always know how to say so. The first memory I have that feels connected to this story is from when I was maybe 6 years old. Renee had a trunk of dress-up clothes in her room, hand-me-downs from a cousin and thrift store finds my mother had picked up for imaginative play. There was a soft yellow dress with little embroidered flowers along the hem, and I remember the fabric felt different from anything I owned, lighter somehow, like it moved with you instead of just hanging there. One rainy afternoon when Renee was at a friend's house, I snuck into her room and put it on. I remember standing in front of her mirror, turning slowly, watching the skirt catch the light from the window. I didn't have words for what I was feeling. I just knew that something about it felt right in a way that was hard to explain, like finally exhaling after holding your breath without realizing you'd been holding it. I heard footsteps in the hallway and panicked, yanking the dress off so fast I nearly tore the seam, stuffing it back into the trunk and pulling my own clothes back on inside out in my hurry. It was my mother. She paused in the doorway of Renee's room, looked at me for a moment, my hair mussed, my shirt clearly backwards, and she just said, "You're allowed to play in here too, you know. Renee won't mind." Then she moved on down the hallway like nothing unusual had happened at all. At 6 years old, I didn't understand the weight of that moment. I only understood relief. I wasn't in trouble. That was enough for me then. Looking back now, I wonder how much she saw in that instant, how much she filed away without saying a word, the way mothers sometimes do, holding pieces of us until we're ready to hold them ourselves. As I got a little older, that feeling didn't go away. It just went underground. I became more careful. I learned the rhythms of the house, when everyone would be gone, when I could safely open that trunk again, or later, when I was 8 or 9, when I could quietly borrow one of my mother's scarves from her closet and drape it over my shoulders like a cape or a shawl, feeling the silk slide against my skin, feeling something settle inside my chest that I didn't yet have a name for. I want to be honest with you about something. For a long time, I didn't think of it as anything more than a strange habit, a private game I played when no one was watching. Boys weren't supposed to like the feeling of soft fabric or the swish of a skirt. At least that was the message I absorbed from every direction. From the boys at school who teased anyone who seemed different. From the cartoons where a boy in a dress was always the punchline. From the quiet but firm expectations that seemed to exist everywhere about who I was supposed to be, simply because of how I'd been born. School was where I first understood that other people had rules about this too, and that breaking those rules had consequences. I remember being in 3rd grade when a classmate named Marcus wore his older sister's nail polish to school one day. Just a pale pink, barely noticeable. And by lunchtime, half the class was laughing at him. I remember feeling sick to my stomach watching it happen. Not because I thought Marcus had done something wrong, but because some part of me recognized that if anyone ever found that trunk of dress-up clothes I still occasionally opened, or knew about the scarves, that could be me standing there red-faced while everyone laughed. So I built a wall. Not all at once, but brick by brick, the way children do when they're trying to protect something fragile inside themselves. I became very good at being what everyone expected. I played baseball, badly but enthusiastically, because my father loved watching me try. I kept my hair short. I never, ever mentioned the dresses or the fabric or the feeling, not to Renee, not to my friends, not even really to myself in any conscious way. I just quietly kept doing it when I could, in stolen moments, and quietly kept feeling ashamed of it in all the moments in between. My grandmother, my mother's mother, used to visit every few weeks, and she was the kind of woman who noticed everything and said very little about it, at least not directly. She had a sewing room in her house, always smelled like lavender and cedar, and I loved being in there, surrounded by spools of thread in every color and the soft whir of her old sewing machine. When I was about 10, she was making a dress for a friend's granddaughter, and she let me sit and watch, occasionally letting me pick fabric swatches from her scrap box, asking me which colors I liked best. I remember spending a long time deciding between a deep emerald green and a dusty rose, feeling that same settling in my chest when I finally chose the rose. "Good eye," she said, holding the swatch up to the light. "You've got a real feel for color, Charlie." It was such a small comment, but I carried it with me for years, turning it over like a stone in my pocket, something smooth and reassuring in a world that otherwise felt sharp-edged about things like this. By the time I reached middle school, the wall I'd built was thick, but it wasn't perfect, and it wasn't free. I remember lying awake some nights with a strange, hollow feeling, like I was watching my own life from a slight distance, playing a role convincingly but never quite inhabiting it. I didn't have the language for gender identity or gender expression back then, not really, not the way people talk about it more openly now. All I had was this persistent, quiet feeling that some part of me was being kept in a locked room, and I was the one holding the key, too afraid to use it. My father and I had a comfortable but not especially deep relationship during those years. He loved me, I never doubted that, but he showed it through actions more than words. Fixing my bike, teaching me to change a tire, taking me fishing on Saturday mornings even though I never much cared for fishing, and he probably knew it. I think he was doing his best to give me the kind of father-son relationship he'd had, or maybe the one he wished he'd had, and I didn't have the heart to tell him that some of it didn't fit me quite right, mostly because I couldn't have explained why even if I'd tried. Renee, for her part, grew into someone I actually liked spending time with once we both got a little older. By the time I was 13 and she was 17, the 4-year gap that had once felt like a canyon started to feel more like a bridge. She'd let me sit in her room while she got ready to go out, and I remember watching her do her makeup with a kind of fascination I didn't fully understand yet. The way she'd tilt her head to check the line of her eyeliner, the practiced ease of her hands. Once, when she was in a generous mood, she offered to let me try some lip gloss, framing it as a joke. "Come on, Charlie, let's see if you can pull this off." And I remember my heart pounding as I said yes, trying to sound casual about it. She laughed when she saw the result, but not unkindly, and said, "Not bad, actually," before wiping it off with a tissue and moving on to her own routine like it was nothing. It wasn't nothing to me. It rarely was. Adolescence brought its own particular difficulties. My body was changing in ways that felt increasingly at odds with the person I sensed myself to be underneath it all, though again, I didn't have a name for that sensation yet. I just knew that looking in the mirror sometimes felt like looking at a stranger wearing my face. I started spending more time alone in my room, telling my parents I was doing homework, when really I was sitting with old magazines Renee had discarded, studying photographs of women's clothing and hairstyles with an intensity that I couldn't have explained to anyone, not even to myself in any words I was ready to say aloud. There was a boy in my grade, David, who became my closest friend around this time. We bonded over comic books and a shared dislike of gym class, and our friendship became one of the steadiest things in my life. I never told David about the private world I kept locked away, not because I thought he'd be cruel about it, but because I genuinely didn't know how to begin explaining something I barely understood myself. Looking back, I think David suspected something was going on with me, some quiet weight I was carrying, because there were times he'd ask, in his own awkward 14-year-old way, "You okay, man? You've been kind of quiet." And I'd always say I was fine, and he'd always let it go, the way good friends sometimes do when they sense you need space rather than pressure. High school arrived, and with it, new pressures and new opportunities for privacy. My parents both worked more by then, my father picking up extra shifts, my mother now full-time at the library, which meant the house was often empty for a few hours after school before either of them came home. Those hours became sacred to me in a way I couldn't have articulated at the time. I started, very cautiously, to experiment beyond scarves and old dress-up clothes. I saved money from odd jobs, mowing lawns for neighbors, and I made a single, terrifying trip to a thrift store 2 towns over, where nobody knew me, and bought a soft blue sweater and the simple skirt, paying in cash, my hands shaking so badly the cashier asked if I was all right. I hid those clothes in the back of my closet, behind a box of old textbooks, and I would only take them out on those empty afternoons, changing quickly, feeling that same settling sensation in my chest, that same sense of finally, briefly, being fully myself, before changing back and hiding the evidence with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. I want to pause here and tell you something my mother told me much later, because it changes the way I understand everything I just described. She knew. She'd known for years. I found this out when I was 17, in a conversation that I still think about regularly, more than a decade later. It happened almost by accident, on an ordinary Tuesday evening in early spring. My father was at a work event, Renee was away at college by then, and it was just my mother and me at the kitchen table, eating a simple dinner of pasta and salad, the radio playing quietly in the background the way it always did when she cooked. I don't remember exactly what triggered the conversation. I think it might have been a news segment that came on briefly before she switched the radio to music. Something about a young person coming out as transgender, though I don't remember the specifics. What I remember is the shift in the air afterward, my mother setting down her fork, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between gentleness and hesitation. "Charlie," she said, "can I ask you something? And you don't have to answer if you're not ready." My stomach dropped in that particular way it does when you sense a conversation is about to become something much bigger than the words that have been spoken so far. "Okay," I said carefully. "Do you remember when you were little, maybe 6, and I found you in Renee's room with the dress-up clothes?" I felt heat rush into my face, an old familiar shame rising up so fast it nearly choked me. Yeah, I remember." "I've thought about that day a lot over the years," she said, and her voice was so soft, so careful, like she was handling something breakable. "And I've noticed some other things, too. The scarves that sometimes went missing from my closet and came back a little wrinkled. The way you used to look at Renee's magazines when you thought no one was paying attention. I'm not trying to embarrass you, sweetheart. I just want you to know that I've seen you for a long time, and I've never once thought there was anything wrong with what I was seeing. I don't think I've ever cried as hard, as suddenly, as I did in that moment. It wasn't sad crying, not exactly, though there was grief tangled up in it too. Grief for all those years I'd spent so certain I had to hide, so certain that if anyone truly saw me they would recoil. It was more like something enormous and long-held finally being set down after being carried for far too long. "I didn't know how to tell you," I managed to say, through tears that felt like they'd been building since I was 6 years old. "I know," she said. I wasn't going to make you tell me before you were ready. That's not how this works. But I didn't want you carrying it alone anymore if you didn't have to. You don't have to, Charlie. Whatever this is for you, whatever it means, you don't have to figure it out by yourself, and you definitely don't have to hide it from me. We talked for hours that night, longer than we'd ever talked about anything before. I told her, haltingly at first, and then with increasing openness, about the feelings I'd carried for so long, the sense of rightness that came over me when I wore certain clothes, the hollow feeling when I didn't, the years of quiet shame layered over something that, once I finally said it out loud, didn't actually feel shameful at all, just true. I want to be clear that I wasn't entirely sure, even then, exactly what all of this meant for my identity in the long term. I didn't walk away from that conversation with some grand, finished understanding of myself. What I walked away with was something more valuable in a lot of ways. Permission. Permission to keep exploring without shame. Permission to take my time. Permission to define this for myself, on my own timeline, without the crushing weight of secrecy I'd been carrying since I was small. My mother asked if I wanted to tell my father, and I remember the fear that question stirred in me, old and familiar. She didn't push. She simply said, "When and if you're ready, I think he'll surprise you. He loves you more than you probably realize. But that's your choice, and there's no timeline you have to follow." It took me almost a year to work up the courage to talk to my father. And when I finally did, it was clumsy and nervous on my part, and quiet and thoughtful on his. He didn't fully understand at first. I could see that in his face, the careful way he was trying to process something outside his own experience. But he asked questions instead of making judgments, and at the end of that conversation, he said something I've held on to ever since. "I don't need to understand every part of this right now to know that you're still my kid, and I'm still proud of you." It wasn't a perfect response, and our relationship took some time afterward to settle into its new shape. But it was honest, and it came from love, and that was enough to build on. Renee, when she found out, reacted with the same easy warmth she'd shown me all those years earlier with the lip gloss. "Took you long enough to tell me," she said, only half joking, and then, more seriously, "I always kind of wondered, you know? I'm glad you trust us with this." The years that followed weren't a straight line towards some tidy resolution, and I don't want to pretend they were, because that wouldn't be honest, and honesty is the whole point of these stories I share with you. There were still moments of doubt, still occasions where old shame crept back in, uninvited, especially in social situations outside my family, where I couldn't be sure how people would react. I lost one friendship over this, a boy I'd known since childhood who simply couldn't reconcile who I was becoming with who he'd expected me to be. And that loss still aches sometimes, even now. But I gained so much more than I lost. Friendships and connections built on a foundation of being truly known rather than carefully performed. College gave me room to explore further, in an environment where I could meet other people navigating similar questions about gender and identity, where I slowly built a wardrobe and a sense of self-presentation that felt authentically mine, rather than something I had to sneak around to enjoy. It was gradual, the way real growth always is. There was no single dramatic transformation, no before and after moment you could point to and say, that's when everything changed. It was 1,000 small moments, stacked one on top of another, each one making the next slightly easier. What stays with me most, though, when I think back on all of it, is my mother's voice at that kitchen table, telling me she'd seen me for years and had never once thought there was anything wrong with what she saw. I think about how much easier certain parts of my childhood might have felt if I'd known that sooner. And I also understand, now that I'm older, why she waited, why she let me come to her rather than forcing the conversation before I was ready. She gave me the dignity of my own timeline, while quietly making sure I knew, in 1,000 small unspoken ways, that I was safe. I've thought a lot about what it means to be truly seen by someone, and how different that is from simply being watched or monitored. My mother watched me for years without ever making me feel surveilled or exposed. She held what she knew gently, waiting for the moment I was ready to hold it too. And when that moment came, she met me there with open arms instead of judgment. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's that the people who love us are often paying closer attention and holding more grace than we give them credit for in our most fearful moments. I spent so many years assuming that being truly seen would mean being rejected, when in my case, it meant something closer to being welcomed home. Thank you for listening to my story. If something in my journey reminded you of your own, I hope you remember that growth often begins with the smallest moments. A swatch of rose-colored fabric, a scarf borrowed in secret, a mother's quiet patience at a kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday night. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you again in the next story. I'm Charlie.